Hello, hello, my friends. AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome back to my face and my card making space. Sympathy cards. I can't even remember the last time I made sympathy cards on my channel. And I used to get a lot of requests. So I thought, it's about time I made some sympathy cards. My personal philosophy with card making, and specifically sympathy cards, is to make them ahead of time. You know, it's one of those things where it's just so much nicer to have them on hand versus trying to make them in the heat of for someone, you know. Obviously it varies across all the different things, but yeah, I would rather make them ahead of time because, you know, emotions and all the things that can just cloud it all. And I also like having extras on hand because that was something I used to get a lot of requests for from people. Was they liked to have handmade by me sympathy cards to give because obviously they're a lot more personal. You know, more efforts put into it than just something you pick up at the dollar store or wherever. You know what I mean? So yeah, I made 4 for today's video, and for the most part you could switch out the sentiments and they could be any occasion cards, but I went with sympathy because I pulled out another oldie but goodie set that came out, I'm not even sure, several years ago, and I'm not even sure if I've ever actually used it. It's the Moments of Grace set from Simon Says Stamp. I'll have a link to it with all the supplies, but there's just a lot of really good sentiments in this set, and it's still available. And yeah, I'm honestly, I don't even know if I've for sure used it, but I pulled it out and I was like, oh. So I ended up using all different phrases in all the insides of the cards, and then yeah, some 3D embossing folders, Neenah Desert Storm cardstock, and Oxide inks because chef's kiss. It's just, I love it. I love it. You guys have been enjoying it, and I did a couple of different random color combos because I've been doing that more too, just reaching for colors and combos that I don't normally do. So anyway, this long-winded intro to say keep watching and I'll show you how I made these cards. I pulled out 2 of the newest 3D embossing folders from Simon Says Stamp that came out in their July Just a Note release, and that's the Golden Fern embossing folder and the Vines embossing folder. And like I always do with Simon's brand specifically, I have my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine with the original platform. I have 2 metal shims and then the folder with cardstock. And I always lightly mist my cardstock with water. I just lay out my little flour sack cloth. That's just to keep me from getting water all over the place. And just light mist. This just helps soften the fibers in the cardstock. And depending on the type of folder, sometimes different patterns, it helps prevent cracking as well. Sometimes, regardless of what I do, the pattern will crack here and there, but most of the time it just doesn't even matter. You won't even notice. I'll just add a little extra glue, those sorts of things. So I use Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. And I was using the 80 pound here because I still have a whole bunch of the 80 pound, which is fine. I prefer the 100 pound. That's what I use for my card bases. But yeah, for like lighter layers and things like that, it is nice to have the 80 pound. I honestly don't know why. I have a whole bunch of it. So I just cut an entire sheet in half, cut it in half again. So I had 4 panels, hence 4 cards. And the embossing. Honestly, you could just do this like just on craft, you know, and add, like, as I finish it, like add a little bit of splatter, add the sentiment, I add a little bit of some twine, and these would make great cards as well, like that, just that very clean and simple look. And I might still end up doing that, you know, when I get that magical free time, because they are just gorgeous, especially the way I love how the Golden Fern one looks, just embossed. But any of them, really. You can't go wrong with embossing folders. I have been obsessed with them now for how long? And I've done a bajillion videos on them and I love them and I'll keep doing them. Anyway, I did 2 different color combos. I was just curious. I've talked about this so much. I love Distress Oxide inks on craft cardstock. There's just something about how it mutes it a little bit, and it just, I don't know. It's just lovely. So this first combo is Ice Spruce, Forest Moss, and Rustic Wilderness. And I just slapped the color on. I did not do anything special. Just grabbed blending brushes and stuck it on. The only thing I did is with the Rustic Wilderness, which darkest shade of green, is I lightly went over almost the entire pattern afterwards, you know, just so it would kind of pick up a little bit on the raised edges here and there. So I did that with both, and I did one of the golden ferns and one of the vines with this combo. And again, very simple. I'm going to add though like splatter and all the things after, which really kind of ties it together, because right this second it looks kind of like, you know. So wiped everything up, set those aside, and then my second color combo was Cracked Pistachio, Evergreen Bough, and Pine Needles. And same thing, I just wipe my brush off on my microfiber cloth, because since I'm using all greens and a green blending brush, and I do what I normally do. So I started with my lightest and then just worked my way to the darkest. And same thing, I just slapped the ink on, you know? And then once I got to the darkest, I did the same thing. I put some ink on the brush and would just lightly, you know, without using really any pressure, go over the folders so that the raised edges kind of picked up a little bit of that darker ink, and it just helps it to stand out just a little bit more. So I did the same thing with both of these backgrounds. And then once I was done blending, that's when I'm going to add splatter, of course, because splatter just works. Plus, I wanted to bring in a little bit of gold, you know, just to give it that little extra something. So cleaned up my workspace again. And then I'm using my Gonzai Tombi Starry Colors, the gold one that I've used in a bajillion videos as well. And my little fan brush, I'd already added water to it, swirled. You have to like work it up in a little pan there. And then I've got it in my splat box, and just all 4 of these backgrounds just added a bit of gold splatter. And you could stop here, this will be fine. But I have like pretty much all of the distress paints. So I grabbed the 2 darkest shades of each of the combos I used. So that was Rustic Wilderness Distress Paint and Pine Needles Distress Paint. And I'm going to use those on the coordinating ones. So the backgrounds that I use the Pine Needles Oxide ink on, that's what I use the Distress Paint on. And you just shake it up really well, stuck it on my palette, picked it up with my brush, splattered it onto the background. And then I'll do the same thing with the Rustic Wilderness on the other 2 backgrounds. And with Distress Paints, they're permanent when dry, so you always want to wash out your brush immediately. Wash out your brush, wipe off your palette, you're good to go. So splattered all these backgrounds with those paints, and kept it fairly subtle and just simple. Again, not overdoing it, not going totally nuts like I do, you know, with most of my cards. So after I did that, I pulled out vellum. This stamp set, again, this came out many years ago. I'm kind of shocked. I thought for some reason it only came out like a couple years ago, and it's like, oh no, this came out like 5 years ago. So there's a little coordinating die set for it, but it's just for the little, because there's a little greenery and stuff in that set. So there's no coordinating die set for like the sentiments in this set. That's fine. I went with like an old school technique, and I just trimmed down strips of vellum. And I just did them all the same size, everything. And I'm going to put these into my Misty, and I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool. And I'm going to stamp the With Sympathy stamp from this set. I centered it on these strips of vellum, and yeah, got it centered. Then I can just use my anti-static powder tool to keep the embossing powder from clinging to where I don't want it. And then I'm going to ink up the sentiment, stamp it with clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to coat it with Simon's Detail Gold embossing powder. Now, I could have done all 4 strips and then melted it all in one step, but I've mentioned this many times. My workspace is generally an absolute disaster. I'm not exaggerating. Like, what you guys see, like I can't even keep my filming space clean. Like all the products are like falling over into everything. So I have nowhere to put them. But if you have the space to set them aside, you can stamp everything, coat it with embossing powder, set it aside, and then melt it all in one step. And it, you know, it just works. But it was just easier for me to do this, melt it, set it aside. You can use, there's, you know, the little clothespin sets that Simon sells. There's, you know, different little things to hold them. I've got asbestos fingers after all these years between cooking and crafting and all this stuff that I'm also very aware of the heat. Like heat tools, got to be careful with them. Like these things, like I keep mine unplugged when I am not using it. I've talked about this before. I know I sound very paranoid, but really, like these are like industrial strength heat tools. And I'm just very aware where the heat is because I'm also a clumsy person. I'll get to that at the end as well. So yeah, I'm just always very aware of the heat source and where it's aimed. And while it looks on video, like sometimes I'm like aiming it right at my hands, I'm not. It's all good. Like even when I say I have asbestos fingers, they're not, you know, they're not completely impervious. Anywho. After I had melted all those sentiments, I wrapped them around each of the panels and then just taped them with washi tape because you're not going to see it. So that just held them in place. And then I wrapped some of my Mayart's ivory twine right below these strips of vellum and used my reverse tweezers to help me tie these in a bow. Just, you know, holds the knot in place. And then I can tie my bow and then trim off the excess. And repeated that on all 4 of these card fronts. So once I had that done, for the actual card bases, again, Neenah Desert Storm cardstock, this time the 100 pound, because that is my preferred bare minimum. That's like the bare minimum weight for me because I like my card bases to, you know, be substantial. And I chose 4 different sentiments from that Moments of Grace stamp set. And each of them I stamped onto the inside of the card with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And originally I was going to leave it there. Like, just there's a good phrase on the inside of each card. But I ended up changing my mind and adding one more little phrase from the set. Because, like, you've got the different phrases for the inside, but there's things like the with sympathy that I use on the front. There's a thinking of you, etc. But there's this one that says, may you find comfort during this difficult time. And I was like, oh, I really liked that, you know? I really liked that because that's another, I've said this before too. That's something I definitely struggle with sometimes is like, what do you write on the inside of cards? You know, sometimes it's, and especially in these sorts of cases, it's hard. And I like good phrases and different sentiments that just kind of convey that. And this was one of those that I was just like, I really liked that. So I lined that up above each of the little phrases and I stamped those with the same darkest Oxide ink. So 2 of them I stamped with Rustic Wilderness. And when I moved to the second card base, since all of these are different, I had to move the stamp each time. And I've shown this before in videos. I just used the backing of one of the stamp set to like the acetate so I could move the stamp without having to clean it. That's all that was. So then the final 2 I stamped with pine needles, and it was just dumb luck that it lined up with both of the different phrases. So I didn't have to move the stamp. I like when that happens. So I stamped that so it gives, you know, 2 tones to the sentiment on the inside, but also just kind of adds to it, you know? So stamped all of that. And then to adhere all these panels to the card bases, I am using some of my Studio Caudia foam tape. So thicker or standard thickness foam tape. This stuff is super sticky. I've talked about this before. It is super sticky. Like probably one of the stickiest foam tapes I've ever used. Can be very frustrating depending on the mood, but I genuinely like it because it's like, okay, these cards are never going to fall apart. They ain't going nowhere. The thing to remember though, with whether it's this foam tape or just, you know, there have been many different foam adhesives or other dry adhesives where you have to remove the backing. And I know a lot of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you go to remove the backing and it is a nightmare. You know, it just doesn't want to come off. You either can do this. I just use the edge of my little Cutter Bee detail scissors. You could use a die pick. I've shown that too. You just, you know, wiggle it underneath the release paper. You can also use a craft knife. I don't do the craft knife trick because it's pretty much guaranteed, because you can see like my fingers are very close there to the scissors. I'm fine with the scissors, but the craft knife and me, clumsy person, just no, because I've sliced myself up with a craft knife before on accident. It's not fun. So having a little tool though to help remove that release paper saves everyone the aggravation. So popped that off, put these into place, and that finished off these cards. I decided not to add any bling. You totally can. It would be fine. And you guys know I have a ton of bling, but I would just, the embossing and the colors and the splat, like this just worked for me. And I was fine with it. I didn't want to add bling this one time, you know, and I always make up for it in the next, you know, card video or whatever. It'll get like 15 different types of splatter, 3 different types of bling. You guys know the drill. So I hope this gives some ideas. I hope to also do more sympathy cards in different ways in the future. It just depends, you know, because they're hard to talk about. You guys know I have a very twisted sense of humor. So I'm always like trying to hold it back and not be ridiculous. And yeah, it just makes me sad, but it also is a nice thing to be able to give to someone when you, in those horrible situations when you need to, is a handmade sympathy card. So like always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I will have picture links in the blog post and pictures of the cards, the full size, etc. So all that will be linked directly below the video if you are interested. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping and commenting. Subscribe if you haven't. I'd love to have you. And I'll see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.